Computer, here we go. Recording, yay, okay, hey everybody. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now, and you will see all the wonderful slides that I created. So, oh, look at that. So, as you know, we are beset with a pandemic, and this is the glory time for epidemiologists. The root word of epidemiology is epidemic, essentially, but we kind of deviated from that in the last few decades, talking about, causality and measurements and study design, all the great stuff for epi. But now this enormous global crisis has put the infectious disease pandemic aspects back under the microscope. So I've been creating a bunch of online courses for medical students around the world, trying to get them up to speed to infectious disease epidemiology. And I'm sharing some of the slides I'm sharing with the medical students with you, and I'll talk around it as well. And it's an exciting time because everybody, A, wants to be an epidemiologist now, and everyone, B, thinks they're an epidemiologist now, if you base it on Facebook comments. And the amount of hate mail that I get, you wouldn't believe how much hate mail I get. It's astounding. All right, let's begin. All right, so first we're going to distinguish between outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. They kind of describe almost the same thing, but not really. And there isn't hard cutoffs between them. These are qualitative distinctions. So an outbreak really is just the manifestation of a disease in a few individuals, like diarrhea that you got from the office picnic. And I got some good diarrhea stories if there's time left over, which there won't be, but I've always got diarrhea stories. An epidemic is when an outbreak is happening in a larger geographical spread. And a pandemic really is when it's global. Now, that's a very vague way of saying things. In fact, an epidemic is the instance of a disease at a rate more than you would otherwise expect. So if you expect like one case of cholera in Ontario per year and you get 3, that's an epidemic, technically. Now, some people have, hard cutoffs. The WHO, as you know, took their time declaring COVID-19 to be a pandemic. And the last pandemic they officially declared was 2009, the H1N1 flu. That's because for administrators, declaring a pandemic is a resource-intensive declaration. It means that some things must be triggered. Money now flows a different direction. Different surveillance systems have to be kicked in. So for administrators, it means something. For epidemiologists, it doesn't mean a whole lot. It just means a pandemic is just an epidemic that happens around the world. So what is an epidemic? Again, it's an outbreak happening on a larger scale. If I go back to that previous slide, really the distinction is not the severity. Like an epidemic is not more severe than an outbreak. It's just happening on a larger geographical scale. And a pandemic, the same thing, a larger geographical scale. You may have heard of the obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic, the stupidity epidemic. So epidemics aren't just of infectious diseases, but that's really how we think about them. But we don't use that term just for pathogens, pathogenic diseases. But for infectious disease, which is our focus for today, you can classify them according to the manner of their spread. And there are in general 3 types of spreading. There's the common source, the propagated, and the mixed. And the common source has 3 types as well: point common source, continuous common source, and intermittent common source. And here's some breakdowns of what those are like. So a common source epidemic is when everyone who gets the disease gets it from a common source. So maybe you're all at that picnic held by the office, and someone brought in a bad batch of chicken salad, and everyone gets sick from the chicken salad. That's the common source. Okay, or maybe you get it from tainted water, which is very common. That's a common source. Or from a factory runoff upstream. That's a common source. Usually you get it from within one disease cycle. But a point source epidemic, that's when there is a particular point that we can identify that all other cases manifested from, usually a point in time. The example of the picnic chicken salad is one. So very often, public health epidemiologists are brought in to investigate outbreaks of diarrhea at like weddings or picnics and things like that. And they track it back and figure, oh, it was Bob brought the chicken salad and he got everybody sick. So that's the point source. And usually all the cases tend to be within one incubation period of the disease because they all got it at the same time. A continuous common source is when they're exposed continuously from this common source. And again, the example of tainted water. If your water supply has bad stuff in it and you're drinking from it every day, you are continuously being exposed. And so the number of cases you're going to get are more than just one incubation period. You're going to get it over the course of the entire year, probably. So it implies that there's a common source that is always there. It didn't go away like the chicken did from the picnic. Intermittent common source is when occasionally it's there, occasionally it's not. An example of this would be if you are in a village downstream from a factory that is pumping toxins into the water, and that's the water that you drink from, but it isn't pumping toxins every day of every week. It's like every other week they do a thing and they dump some mercury in there or something. So people are getting sick on a regular basis over a time period, but not every single day. So that's intermittent common source. And propagated is what most of us think about with infectious diseases. Did you hear my dog barking in the background? No. So that's when one person gets it and then give it to somebody else and give it to somebody else. And that's how infectious diseases of the COVID variety and the flu and the common cold work. It's spread by people. It's propagated by people. You can have a mixed process too. We have features of both common source and propagation. For example, shigellosis, which is a disease you get from drinking water that some animals have pooped into who are infected. So campers can get it. So it's entirely possible that someone goes camping, they drink for some water, and I mean, a bunch of campers go, they drink some tainted water and they get it. That's a common source. But they go home and they make dinner for their family and they pass it on to their families through their unwashed hands and things like that. So they are propagating it, but it was a common source originally. So there are mixed features. And how we graph the epidemic curve reveals the nature of whether it was a common source or propagated or mixed. So let's talk about the history of pandemics, at least recently. So right now, of course, we're in the midst of the COVID era, which would be a defining moment in your lives, guaranteed. And this is, we know now, due to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which was, we think, originated in China in late fall of 2019. And since then, we've had more than 1 million deaths, over 50 million infections, I think, or 35 million. I can't get my numbers straight anymore. There's so many. And it's still raging along. Very recently, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which is still with us, of course, but it's past its peak due to having therapies and control mechanisms in place. Between 2005 and 2012 is when the peak years were, and that's killed 36 million people. So it is, by all measurements, a far worse pandemic than COVID. It's just the control is more obvious because of the nature of the transmission. We'll talk about that later on. Influenza is always a concern. And the next great pandemic will probably be influenza. I mean, influenza is a torturous, destructive disease, believe it or not. As I mentioned, 2009 was the most recent pandemic officially declared, but 68, 56, 1889, all these famous flus. And of course, the Spanish flu of 1918, which is what we were always comparing COVID to, killed, we think, over 50 million people. In fact, it may have been one of the causes of World War I ending, because it might have taken so many soldiers off the battlefield that you couldn't fight anymore. And it's an odd disease because it affected the young more than the old. COVID seems to kill mostly the old, as you know. The Spanish flu killed mostly the young. A lot of theories around that. Maybe a version of it was floating around for generations earlier, and older people had been exposed to it, so had some lingering immunity. And in fact, today, H1N1 floating around is a descendant of the Spanish flu. It has genetic components of the Spanish flu. So these diseases never really leave us. They have a genetic lingering in the population. Go back further, the cholera pandemics. There's one going on right now, believe it or not, that doesn't get much media play. It's killed millions of people. And in fact, epidemiology was founded, I don't know if in this course you've covered the history of epi with John Snow being the founder, but John Snow was an investigator in the 1800s in London, and he was looking at outbreaks of cholera and found they all came from a single pump in the neighborhood, the Broad Street pump. And you can go to London now and visit the pump. It's there enshrined as a historical monument, as the foundation point of epidemiology. Again, what kind of propagation was this? Was it common source, propagated, or mixed? You think about that. But that's how epidemiology was discovered, by investigating cholera using mathematical methods. The plagues of London that include the Black Death, that is bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. multiple scores of outbreaks over the years, killed possibly 20% of Europe. Smallpox, as you know, was a great scourge of until very recent times, and we wiped it out. It's one of two diseases, possibly three. Guinea worm is still with us, I think. We've eradicated two diseases, rinderpest, which is an agricultural disease, and smallpox, possibly guinea worm. I'm not sure about that. But smallpox was eradicated when epidemiologists figured out that you only had to inoculate a certain percentage, the herd immunity percentage. And we did it with an effective vaccine. But before that, smallpox was the great big killer of most Native Americans when the Europeans arrived. So tens of millions of deaths. The Black Death, of course, was the bubonic plague, 200 million deaths. The plague of Justinian, named after the emperor of Byzantium in the decades post-AD, was also bubonic plague. We've been struggling with bubonic plague for a long time. So one thing I'll mention about Black Death, of course, is we learned many things about infectious disease control during the Black Death outbreaks, among them quarantine. So 1348 was the first time we used quarantine as a public health measure. This was done in Venice in response to the Black Death. And keep in mind, back then, we didn't know what pathogens were. We didn't know what caused the bubonic plague. Was it a curse from God? Was it ether, miasma coming out of the swamp gas at night, which is one of the theories? We didn't know. But we know that the infected people, if you lock them up, they're not going to give it to anybody else. So the gears were churning amongst investigators. Zoonoses, if you haven't covered it already, that's a kind of disease that comes from non-human animals and jumps into humans. So many of the worst pandemics in history were caused by zoonotic diseases. And many viruses and bacteria have this quality where they can share DNA if they are hanging out together. So two different animals, species are together, and an influenza virus that infects one gets to interact with the influenza virus that affects the others. Hey, I got this fun piece of DNA, maybe you want it, and they swap. So they have a different kind of evolution that allows more labile and agile adaptation. So zoonoses are caused by a bunch of things, not just viruses and bacteria, but funguses, fungi as well, and parasites. And here are some of the important zoonoses in history. COVID is a zoonosis. We think it came from bats, and we think it was amplified in a second species, the pangolin, before jumping into humans. And we think it's probably happened in the wet markets of Asia, where, again, a variety of species are coming together in a way that is unnatural, and often they are ill. So a caged bat is next to a caged pangolin, next to a caged chicken, and they're all kind of sick. And now their various viruses are interacting. Which brings me to a paper I read back in 2007 that showed us the lessons we learned from SARS. If you're too young to remember SARS, SARS was a big epidemic we had back in 2003, the precursor of COVID. And this was a wake-up call to many of us that we have very poor pandemic processes in place. And the three lessons that this paper put forth were, number one, transparency and messaging is key, which we have failed at, by the way, here. Number two, the best technologies are 19th century technologies. So we can talk all we want about apps and things like that, but nothing beats hiding in your house and wearing a mask. And number three is that animal husbandry might be bad for human health, which will, trigger a lot of the carnivores out there, I'm sure. But more and more, the more we interact with different kinds of animal species, the more we threaten infectious disease epidemics. HIV is a zoonosis that originated in primates. Malaria, of course, associated with mosquitoes. Ebola, the natural reservoir for Ebola, the place where it lives usually is bats, we think. Salmonella, turtles and unwashed chicken. Bird flu and swine flu are named that way because of birds and swine. That's where it comes from. Anthrax from livestock. Plague, we talked about plague already. There's some controversy over what the natural reservoir for plague is. Is it some kind of rodent, birds or something else? Who knows? Lyme disease, tick-borne. Toxoplasmosis we get from cats. And it's one of the reasons we keep pregnant women away from cats, because they can get toxoplasmosis and it's problematic for pregnancies. Histoplasmosis comes from bird droppings. Giardia from other kinds of animal droppings, etc., etc. So let's talk about how we get infected. There are a handful of ways. And this is important for COVID because if you're paying attention, as I think you all have been, and if you haven't been, pay attention because this is a moment in history that's interesting, especially for health science students. We didn't know really how COVID was being transmitted. We made some assumptions. We're wrong about some of these assumptions. So one way that infectious diseases are transmitted is via direct contact. So that means that when my mucous membranes interact with your mucous membranes, yes, right? So maybe sexual contact is an obvious way that works. Blood sharing, you know, that works as too. So HIV, famously, you get it from tainted blood products or from sexual contact. So mucous membranes interacting. Feces as well. You can interact with people's feces, as many are wont to do, and get infected. I'm watching Annie's face for reactions to my jokes, and she never reacts. It makes me very upset. So then we have droplet transmission, which is how we think COVID is most commonly transmitted. So droplets are chunks, virus wrapped in respiratory fluids that are ejected from our lungs and projected beyond our face. And they're heavy droplets. They're maybe 3 microns in width, and they tend to fall to the ground. And if they land on your face and make their way to your mucous membranes, like your nose, your mouth, your eyes, then they gain entrance into your body and you get infected that way. There's a lot of controversy about how far they drop. And this is why we have social distancing. So a lot of studies have been done this past century over influenza droplets. And they found that about 95% of influenza droplets fall within 1 meter of someone breathing. And 99.9% fall within 2 meters of someone breathing. And for every meter you add, the risk drops by another 50%. That's why some countries only have a 1 meter social distance rule, because that's 95%. Other countries like Canada have a 2 meter rule. The USA has 1.8 meters because that's 6 feet, and that's how they operate. So there's controversy there. And also, if you're talking, droplets go further. If you're singing, they go further still. If you're coughing and sneezing, they go really far. And of course, we've got data suggest in some cases they can go like for 18 meters. But on average, most people's droplets fall within 2 meters. So that gives us a tool now, a mitigation tool. Keep your distance. Now transmission can be reduced at the population level. Indirect contact, we call this fomite contact. That's when an object is in between the person who's infected and the person getting infected. So imagine that you sneeze on your hand and you touch a doorknob, and someone else comes along, touches that same doorknob, then wipes their face, and suddenly the gook from the sneeze is now in their face. That's what fomite transmission is. Originally, we thought this would be a huge thing with COVID. The common cold has a strong fomite component, which is why if you wash your hands regularly, you can avoid getting the common cold. That's why we told everyone early on, just wash your hands and wipe down your groceries and deep clean the bathrooms and all these things I call hygiene theater, schools investing in all this money to clean classrooms and stuff, which really, frankly, doesn't make that much difference. It probably helps a little bit, but from my point of view, for COVID, fomite transmission is not a big deal. It does happen, probably. We have no actual strong evidence. It probably happens, but it's droplet most of the time, we think. Now, that brings us to airborne. And this was controversial for a long time because only a handful of diseases are truly airborne. Chickenpox is airborne. Measles is airborne. Airborne diseases are when the nuclei of those droplets, which is much smaller than 3 microns, floats about in the air. If you look around your room right now and you see bits of dust flowing around, that's essentially an aerosol particle. So imagine like a virus landing on that and float for hours, if not days. Whereas, the droplets fall right away, aerosols float around. So aerosols are very dangerous and they could infect really powerfully. And over the course of this year, you probably saw the debate over, is this an aerosol disease or isn't it? It is. There is no debate. It's an aerosol disease. The question is aerosol now the major mode of transmission? It is becoming so as we control the droplets. The aerosol, by comparison, become more important. That's why long flights are dangerous. That's why schools, wear all the masks you want. If there isn't good ventilation, you're in trouble. Gyms, again, you need ventilation. That's why the push for ventilation is on, to get this stuff out of the air. Okay, so aerosols are huge. A vector transmission, that's when like an insect, a living animal, is the thing that transmits the infection. So mosquito bites a malaria-infected person, gets a plasmodium parasite, bites somebody else and transmits it that way. People thought that COVID would be vector transmitted. It is not. Don't worry about that. Okay, so disease transmission has, essentially three moments or three important components. There's a reservoir. That's where it is right now. The natural reservoir is where it lives when it isn't here. Like I said, the natural reservoir of Ebola is probably bats, but somehow made into people. And if we wipe it out in people, it'll just go back to bats. So eradicating a disease with a natural reservoir that's not human is difficult. It's possible, but difficult. So the reservoir is the people it's infecting. Now the mode of transmission we've gone through already. Droplet, fomite, aerosol, etc. And then of course there's the susceptible population, the people who don't yet have it, but who can get it. So they can get it as the stuff enters in their eyes or the nose or the mouth or through their skin through an insect bite or a syringe or something that can break the skin. So suddenly, for transmission to occur, all three of these things must be present. There must be a reservoir, a way to get out of the reservoir, and a person that can accept it. So it gives us an opportunity now to impose infection control tools in between each of these boxes here. Like if you are not near the reservoir, you cannot get infected. If the reservoir is quarantined, you cannot have a mode of transmission. If there is a mask between the reservoir and the susceptible person, there is no mode of transmission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In pandemics, there are in general, two phases. One is which there is slow transmission, or sometimes pathogens in general have slow transmission. Then you can do something kind of easy. You can deploy TTI, testing, tracing, and isolation tools. So imagine COVID has just arrived on your shores and you saw it coming and you're ready. Then we just monitor the population. For the first sign of someone infected, you descend on that person, contact trace them, make sure you know everyone they've come in contact with, and you test everyone and you make them quarantine. Now it's unlikely that that disease is going to take hold in your population and spread. On the other hand, once it starts spreading, the second phase, then you have to deploy some other tools. TTI alone will not be sufficient. You need mitigation tools. These mitigation tools we'll talk about in a second. You probably know what they are already. And the goal for the mitigation tool is to, again, flatten the epidemic curve. And I think we're talking about epidemic curves. I don't remember what kind of slides I put in here, but you'll see that in a second. So testing, tracing, and isolation. That's our first layer of control here. If we don't know who has it, then we're lost already. So testing is important. Tracing is the second half of testing. You got to trace to figure out if the person you found who has it gave it to somebody else. And you isolate them, as we learned in 14th century Venice. Quarantine them so they cannot interact. Even if you haven't got a cure, you can prevent them from spreading. So the mitigation tools we have, we mentioned hand washing, which works great for the common cold. It can't hurt with COVID. Distancing we talked about for droplets. Masks and gloves are good for, again, the reason masks work. Masks are not PPE, they're not personal protective equipment meant to protect yourself, unless you're wearing a medical grade fine 1 micron or 3 micron fabric. If you're wearing a regular cloth mask, the reason you're wearing it is for it to be a windbreak so that your breath doesn't go 2 meters, it goes a couple of centimeters. Now suddenly you don't have to stay a meter away from someone, you can walk right by them and their mask prevents the droplet from going further. In general, again, this is all about population. When you scale this up to a population, it has mitigation effects. Cleaning toilets is important for some diseases. Now, COVID is transmissible by feces. We have found viral residue in people's poop. But so far, no one we know of has gotten it from interacting with anyone else's feces. So if that's your thing, poop interaction, you might be okay. So, and of course, quarantine is another tool that we always have. All right, epidemic curves, epi curves. Everyone's now an expert in epi curves because you see them on the news every single day. It's so exciting. It's so exciting arguing with overnight armchair epidemiologists on Twitter who've learned everything from the news. You hear the frustration in my voice, you know where it comes from. Good times. So the epidemic curve shows us the frequency of new cases, incidence rate, based on the date of onset. Now, it's not a proportion, it's raw numbers, it's numerator data only, which is useful in outbreaks. When you're comparing populations, then that denominator data becomes interesting. So the shape of the curve tells us about whether it's propagated or common source or intermittent, and the horizontal axis is the time and so forth, and the vertical is the x-axis. So here's epi curves. Why include this slide? Let's skip it. So here's a epi curve, right? In general, we expect them to be symmetrical. That's from something called Farr's law. And Farr observed that the rate of climb is often the same as the rate of decay. But you know what? It often isn't. So Farr's law isn't a law, it's an observation. And I know that the province, when they release their modeling numbers and stuff, they're always applying Farr's law for the symmetrical curve, which is interesting to me. I don't know why exactly they do it, because it's almost never observed to be symmetrical. So here is a point source outbreak. Looks kind of like this. So here can you see my mouse? Hopefully, okay. So the point source here it's because there's one point in which people got infected. The cases rise and then they decline, but they're not being reinfected. A continuous common source, they never go down because they're always getting reinfected. And intermittent common source, well, you see it up and down like this. Okay? So, and a propagated one looks a lot like this, multiple waves, which is why we're in a second wave, as we call it, or a second resurgence, as I prefer to call it, because wave implies you just got to wait it out. Right. So here's an example of how you can use an epi curve to learn about things. So here's an example: lab testing criteria changed, and that sort of changed how we defined a case, and numbers went down a bit. Now we started banning people at this date, and our exponential growth kind of leveled off a bit. So we knew that intervention resulted in some results. It's not conclusive, it's suggestive. But an epi curve we use to monitor in real time the impacts of our mitigation strategies. I'll check the time here. Okay, great. All right. So epi curves are lagging indicators because there's a delay between when people got infected and when their symptoms arise, when they got tested, and when we know about it. And that's when we add that dot. Now, a proper epi curve will be backdated to the point of actual infection, but oftentimes it isn't. Okay. So often the date of illness is not known. So public health hasn't got that information. And so you're plotting the date of reporting, which is not very accurate. It's created a lot of chaos in understanding COVID, showing where spikes happened here, but in fact they didn't, they happened earlier. Really quite confusing. So these lagging indicator effects are quite profound and important. Remember that deaths are also lagging. So even though here in this curve here, the incidence rate is going up, then down, and you think you're out of the woods, your hospitalization and death rates are increasing, even though the incidence rate is coming down, because this group here, the peak of the deaths, represent the peak of the incidence rate some weeks earlier. So with COVID, it takes about 2 weeks to resolve on average a case. And then if you're going to be hospitalized and die, that's between 3 and 5 weeks. So the moment you see a spike in cases, you wait between 3 and 5 weeks to see that same spike in the hospitalization and death data. This is a difficult thing for decision makers, media, and the public to get around their heads. They see the numbers are going down and want to know why are our hospitals still overwhelmed? Because of lagging indicators, and also because of exponential growth. Because we let the cats out of the bag, and now we start putting some cats back in, or the bag is closed, but guess what? The cats are still tearing down your curtains and things like that. So exponential growth and lagging indicators cause crisis in understanding what's going on. So let's talk now about the indicators we use to track epidemics. Among them, you probably covered in your course the case fatality rate. It's probably the first important metric for understanding the lethality of a disease. And it's simply the fraction of known cases that die. the fraction of known cases that die. And the key here is the known cases. So the number of confirmed cases is the denominator, and the number of deaths caused by the disease is on top. Notice I put caused by the disease because a clinical determination is made that the disease played an important role in that death. It isn't simply everyone who died. Like the big COVID denial thing. Well, if you happen to have COVID and got killed in a car crash, they count that as a COVID death. They're inflating the numbers. Well, right? No, a clinical determination is made that there's COVID was in that causal pathway. We usually give this as a percentage. There it is. So the thing about the CFR, though, it's really an estimate of the IFR, the infection fatality rate. And this is another cause for headaches in Twitter and Facebook world as I do battle with the deniers every day. Because the IFR is going to be lower than the CFR. Why? The IFR is the true probability that you're going to die if you get this disease. The CFR is not. The CFR will change on a week-to-week basis because we know about a different number of cases. And also we know about the worst cases because the people who get tested are the most serious ones who come to you and therefore more likely to die. But the IFR, the denominator is everybody who gets the disease, whether you know about it or not. And the numerator is everybody who dies of the disease, whether you know about it or not, which automatically lets you know you're never going to get an accurate estimate because there are many you'll never know about. So IFRs are always modeled, never computed outright. So there's a lot of debate in literature about what the true IFR for COVID is. Most agree it is somewhere between 0.5 and 1%, which doesn't sound huge, but it's huge. For an infectious disease of this nature, that's a large number. So here are the IFRs for 1918 flu, we think is 0.27%. If COVID is like 0.6%, 0.7%, that's twice as big already. 2.6% for 57 USA flu, that's pretty high. Yeah, that's a pretty lethal disease. So the worst case of the regular flu is about 0.12% IFR. If COVID is 0.6%, again, that's 5 times worse. So, and if it's more infectious, it's going to affect a lot more people. Therefore, that larger denominator means more actual raw deaths. So right now in the USA, they've got 250,000 deaths. On a given bad flu year, you'd see 50,000 deaths. So automatically, they're 5 times more deaths. Right? So it is far more deadly than the flu, despite what you may hear from your idiot friends. Okay, so some things that affect the CFR. Clinical experience. So the more experience we get with treating a disease, the death rate is going to come down. The CFR death rate is going to come down. Right, so right now, if you get the disease, get COVID now versus February, you have a higher chance of living now because now we know the ventilator settings. We have some drugs from Desivir, which probably doesn't work actually, dexamethasone, which definitely does work, and some new monoclonal antibodies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The comorbidities of the patient affect the CFR, as we all well know now because the rallying cry of a COVID denier. But what about the pre-existing conditions? By the way, who's got pre-existing conditions? Everybody's got pre-existing conditions. You know this if you ever tried to buy travel insurance. They'll ask you, got any pre-existing conditions? Yeah, I got asthma. Oh, well, we can't insure you. So everyone's got pre-existing conditions. So just put that nonsense out of your head right away. Okay, and new treatments will emerge as we are seeing right now. Okay, measuring the denominator is a big issue. As I noted, the more testing you do, the more people you find. And if you widen your testing parameters, you find more milder cases who are less likely to die. So the CFR comes down again. So in early September, people were asking, hey, the cases are going up, but the death rates aren't going up. Clearly, has the disease mutated? The disease did not mutate. What happened was we were testing more asymptomatic people who were less likely to die. And so the death rate.
Yo, dog, I gotta pour your coffee so I can make myself some. You gotta what? I gotta pour your coffee somewhere so I can make myself some. Okay.
So someone needs to mute their mic there. All right. So here we have the CFR in China from January to February. And we see in different parts of China, it's going down. Right? The disease didn't mutate. It's just that the testing parameters changed and experience in treating it changed as well. Right? And you can use the CFR as an indicator of your health system responsiveness. If it, I mean, poor countries are going to have higher CFR, they have worse medical care. Yeah, simple as that. You'll find as the disease gets worse in terms of overwhelming a system, like we'll see in Utah. Utah are rationing care now, which is scary. The CFR is going to go up because they're not able to give people the same quality of care. Right? Now here are the IFRs, or the initial CFRs rather, all over the place because different countries were doing different things, different capacity to respond. Now let's talk about the reproduction number. This one makes the news all the time, and now everyone's an expert, so let's go through. The R naught is the base reproduction number. This is, before you apply any mitigation tools, what's the average number of people, the average number of new infections that an old infection will produce. So if it's 2, well, I told 2 friends and they told 2 friends and so on and so on and so on. Right? The thing about the R naught is if it's 1, everything is cool. If it's anywhere greater than 1, 1.001, that is by definition exponential growth. Okay, so I'll see if I got an example here. Here's a nice little graphic. Got to move my little screen around here. So here's if you look at that middle scenario, this is the R naught of 1. At time 0, 2 people are infected. These are yellow people. At time 1, which is defined as when those first 2 people are removed. And by removed, I mean either they recover or they die. In either case, they're not infectious anymore. So at the end of time 1, when these 2 people are removed, they will have infected exactly 1 person each, R equals 1. So now, how many infectious people do we have? 2. At time 2, when these 2 people now are either recovered or dead, they will have infected 1 person each. So 2 and 2 and 2. So throughout the entire time, there are exactly 2 people who are infectious. Steady state. The pandemic is not growing or shrinking. We can manage that. If it's 0.5, let's say, you have 2 people after one cycle, disease cycle. So these 2 people are either dead or recovered. They will have infected on average 1 person between them. And by the time this person is recovered or dead, they will have infected 0 people. So the pandemic is extinguished within 2 disease cycles. If it's R naught is 2, what happens now? After 1 cycle, these 2 people have infected 4. After 2 cycles, they've infected 8, and so forth. What's that? 16 and 64. So that's exponential growth. If it's 3, oh my God, it explodes horribly. If it's 1.1, it grows up slower, but it's still exponential. An R naught of 1.1 is terrifying. In Canada right now, we have somewhere between 1.2, 1.4. That's why we're in the crisis we're in. We're in exponential growth. It doesn't take a lot to overwhelm. And this is what I'm trying to get people to understand so often is we are not wired to understand exponential growth. Our brains are linear oriented. Compound interest is exponential growth. If you invest in that great stock early on, you can put in $10 when Apple was like really, really cheap and be a millionaire today. If you wait until the exponential growth is really late, you got to invest like several $100,000 to get that million. So that's why it's important when we see an R naught greater than 1 to act hard and early to get it on the ground floor so that you don't have to do anything worse later on. So again, if the R naught is greater than 1, there should be 1 there, then we have epidemic is worsening. If it's equal to 1, it's holding steady. Less than 1, it's diminishing. Right. So the things that affect the R naught is the rate of contacts. That's the first thing. How many people do you interact with in a given day? The probability of infection. Okay, so maybe if you're interacting with people, but you're not touching them and you're wearing a mask and the disease is not airborne, the probability goes down. And the duration of infection. If I'm infectious for like weeks, I got a lot more chances of passing it on. If I'm infectious for only half an hour, very low probability of passing it on. So we talk a lot about herd immunity. What is herd immunity? The example I always give is if you are, let me check the time here. We're doing time-wise. Okay, got a good time. If you are, let's say, in a herd of cattle walking down the ravine, as herds of cattle do, They keep the young and the weak in the middle, and the strong cows are on the outside. The cows and the bulls are on the outside. The thing is, if they encounter a predator, they will deal with the predator so well that the ones inside the herd not only are protected from the predator, they don't even know the predator was there in the first place. They have herd immunity from that predator. That's what we want for diseases, to have sufficient people that are immune so that those who aren't immune don't have to deal with it. They're in the center of the herd. So how do you compute what that threshold is? It depends on the R naught, how explosively infectious that disease is. And essentially it's 1 over the R naught is the proportion of the population that needs to be immune before the disease cannot take hold and expand further. For COVID, we think that's going to be around 80%. 75, 80%, depending upon what the R naught is. So here's some examples of R naughts and the herd immunity thresholds. So for measles, let's go back to COVID first. COVID, it's Droplet, probably airborne. We think the R naught somewhere between 1.4 and maybe 4. I think it's probably around 2, to be honest. That means our herd immunity threshold is going to be just under 80%. So as the vaccine gets enrolled, that's the target. Look at measles. R naught of up to 18, because measles is scary infectious, which is why we should cling to that measles vaccine and love it. Love it. Like it's your long lost girlfriend or boyfriend. Love that measles vaccine. It keeps us from having torrential epidemics regularly. If we wanted to create herd immunity, we need like 95% of the population vaccinated. So all these anti-vaxxers denying the measles vaccine, it doesn't take a lot to create a crisis to reduce the herd immunity threshold. Smallpox, same thing, right? We managed to eradicate smallpox by inoculating 86% of the human race. Take a bow, scientists. That's extraordinary, right? And so on and so on and so on. Right? So if influenza every year, the uptake of the flu vaccine is about 40%. So we barely make it sort of every year. That's why we don't get really bad flu seasons when a lot of people die. Thousands still die. It isn't bad as we think, because every year enough people get it that we achieve something resembling herd immunity. And by the way, you can lower the herd immunity threshold by maintaining mitigation strategies. So for the COVID vaccine, we need 74 to 80% of the population to get vaccinated to have perfect herd immunity. But if we get 50% vaccinated, that'll keep the disease at bay if we're also wearing masks and distancing, because the artificial R naught will come down. It won't be an R naught, it'll be an RE, right? An effective reproduction number, but semantics. So let's talk about modeling now, because every now and then governments release a model, and the media always calls me to comment on it. I never know what to say because it's a model. What do you want me to say? It's a graph. Look at the graph. Graphs are graphs. So in general, the challenge with modeling, as I mentioned, is differentiating between linear growth and exponential growth. And the idea that the disease are going to explode exponentially, mitigation factors and behavioral factors will slow that growth, flatten it out, and eventually drive it down. So the most common epidemic model is called the SIR model. It stands for susceptible, infected, and this should be removed, not recovered. I got to fix that. Removed. So we all start out susceptible because we don't have the disease yet and we're not immune, so we can get it. Some people become infected. Amongst those infected people, eventually all of them will be removed. Either they will recover or they will die. Either way, they're removed. So the flow of people from this compartment into this compartment into that compartment is what we're really modeling. And they're described by differential equations. Sometimes we expand the SIR model into the SEIR model, where an E is for exposed. So not everyone who is susceptible is going to be exposed. Some people will hide in their houses. Some people just don't come into contact with the people who are infected. So the rate at which susceptible are exposed is a factor that affects the rate at which they become infected and infectious. I got to fix that. And the rate that they become removed from the situation. Now, the model has differential equations associated with it. So it's a function. So S of t, I of t, R of t, and so forth. Right. So And these describe the fraction of the population that remains susceptible. So as the epidemic continues, that fraction diminishes because more people become infected, fewer are susceptible, more become infected, and more also are removed. I got to fix all these slides, man. Here's what it looks like. So if you follow the blue, this line here first, the dark blue one, or the whatever that is, mauve, what is that color? I'm a standard stupid man. I don't know colors. I know your basic red, green, and blue. I don't know what mauve is. So this is the removed population. Hang on. This is let's back up. Susceptible population starts at 500 people. Everyone is susceptible. As the disease continues, that number diminishes. They're recovered or removed. No one's removed, but as the disease continues, either people die or become immune and eventually saturate out at 500. But the infection, that is the epi curve that we want. That shows it climbing to the point where almost all the susceptible people have been infected, reaching herd immunity, and then it diminishes after that. So you probably see in that shape in some of the models presented by the governments. That's essentially what they're doing, presenting a combination of differential equations interacting such that we get that shape. So here's the Spanish model that they used early on in Spain. So as you see, the infected people go up and it comes down, and the recovered increases at the same rate. There's also a couple other factors to consider, the C and R. So the C is how quickly people become infected. So it's the rate at which we interact with each other, the contact rate. And the small r, not the r sub naught, the small r is how quickly people become healed or recovered. Yeah. So how long will you spend in the hospital before we can remove you from the model? So those two factors, when you divide them, that gives you the basic reproduction number. That's how we compute it. Now, there are actually a number of formulas for computing the reproduction number at a given time, but they're all kind of based on this idea. Important quote here: all models are wrong, but some are useful. What does that mean? It's what I say to all the reporters when they ask me to comment on a new model. This is not a crystal ball. It's not a prediction. It just tells us the shape in which things are going. The magnitude is probably going to be wrong. Right now in Canada, we're predicting 60,000 cases per day by the end of the year. I personally think that's far too high, but we can argue over the magnitude, but the direction is not wrong. It's definitely going to increase. And the point of that model is to show that with the current public health measures in place, we're still seeing exponential growth. If we reduce personal contacts, we're still going to see exponential growth. If we let things fly and expect people to interact as much as they will over Christmas, we're going to see explosive exponential growth. That's how the model is useful. The actual magnitude we can debate, but it allows us to steel ourselves for worst case scenarios and to understand that current mitigation strategies right now are insufficient in Canada. Additional tools need to be deployed. So let's talk a bit about the epi of COVID-19, which is supposed to be most of what I talk about here, which I kind of got off on a tangent. If you don't know, SARS-CoV-2 is a single-strand RNA virus. We have DNA viruses as well. This is what it looks like. And on the surface is things we call the spike protein, which is important because all the new vaccines are based upon identifying the spike protein. And they're so cool. New vaccines are so cool. It is a kind of coronavirus, which is the virus that describes much of the common cold. SARS and MERS were also coronaviruses. We don't really know where it comes from. Cue the conspiracy theorists, but we think it came from a bat, and we think it came from the wet markets of China. And as I mentioned, we think transmission is usually through droplets, but maybe airborne as well. We think that peak viral load occurs in 4 or 5 days. You're most infectious about 2 days before you start showing symptoms. So this is an asymptomatic pandemic, which makes it doubly scary and doubly hard to control. And we think that the basic reproduction number is between 1.4 and 3. In China, it was like 5.7, which is pretty high, which scared us a bit. And that means it explodes through populations, especially long-term care facilities. So the challenges for COVID are its very high transmission rate. It may not seem high if you don't study the stuff, but it's quite high. It's higher than the flu. And we have many asymptomatic people that are spreading it. And you're going to see right now in the USA, we think that 60% of transmission is caused by asymptomatic people. When I made this slide, no vaccines were available. Guess what? We have vaccines. Let's have a drink to science. Good vaccines too. So we're going to be out of this by next year, I predict. So don't worry too much about it. It has a relatively high hospitalization rate as compared to the flu. And therefore, there's a strong possibility to overwhelm our hospital systems, as we saw in Italy, as we are seeing in parts of the USA. So how do we know if we're doing enough testing? There's an important indicator called the test positivity ratio, and that is the fraction of the number of tests that you are done that come back positive. Again, everyone knows about this now. When I first started doing interviews back in March, I had to explain how this works. But everybody talks about the TPR, the test positivity ratio. In general, it is a good benchmark to determine if you are testing enough. So the thing about the test positivity ratio is two indicators in one. It tells us the numerator and the denominator. So the numerator, obviously, the number of things that come back positive we care about. The denominator, are we doing enough testing? So if the number is high and you test more and it stays high, oh my goodness, that means you've got deep penetration into your community. If it comes down as you test more, it means your problem is you weren't testing enough or not strategically enough. So it's a very good indicator. And we use this indicator to make some decisions. So in New York, they decided that 3% TPR is when you close schools. Here in Ontario, the TPR in coordination with the incidence rate and hospitalization rate are what we use to determine if you're in the green zone, the orange zone, the red zone, etc. So how do we control COVID right now? As you know, we have our mitigation tools, distancing, masks, and hand washing. I have an entire shtick where I talk about the tools available to the government. We have choices between hard suppression, suppression plus mitigation, or elimination. So Australia and New Zealand have the elimination strategy, the COVID zero strategy. What we have now is a circuit breaker attempt, which is a short suppression strategy, all of which is debatable. And there is no right answer, except the one that I think is right, which I won't share with you. So we have, this was a famous graph by Thomas Pugh back in March, and he changed the way we think about this. He talked about the hammer and the dance, which I thought was what we were doing, but we didn't dance well. The hammer was a hard suppression, hard lockdown, drive the cases down. How's it work? It works because if you cannot see people, if you can't go to work and go to school and interact with people, you cannot spread the disease. So after a couple of disease cycles the RT drops low and the incidence rate dwindles very, very low. Then when you open up, you deploy overwhelming public health tools to test, trace, and isolate, and you dance. You hammer, then you dance. The problem is you can only dance if you know the steps. We lost a step somewhere down the road, and now we have to hammer again. And so the dance tries to keep the R below 1. Right. That's the COVID part of today's lecture. Let me check the chat screen to see if any questions before I would continue on to, right? No questions about COVID. I'm going to go on now to talk about grad school stuff. Let me go back to my sharing of screens. Sharing screen, no, wrong screen. Sharing the screens, there we go. Okay, I'll talk about a bunch of things, MPH versus MSc versus a bunch of other things. And first, I'm going to share, this video with you, obviously, but I do have a couple of blog posts you might be interested in. One is how to write a letter of intent for grad school. It's pretty good, if I can say so myself. Explains what you need to know for your letter. The letter does matter. And how to pick a grad school. Some of the factors you may be considering. If it's epidemiology, they're all good. Don't worry about it. Okay. And I got a couple of videos we had made earlier on with the Society for Epidemiology on how to apply to grad school, some of the tips and so forth. So let me close this window and talk about some stuff now. All right, grad school. First of all, the difference between MPH and MSc Epi. Epidemiology is the science of the gods, handed down from Apollo to we mere mortals so that we can have dominion over the beasts of the world. And MPH is a watered down version. No, I'm kidding, mostly. Here is my take on the history of MPHs in epidemiology. And I'm sure the administrators will disagree with me, but I'm right. MPHs were created for clinicians, doctors and so forth, to gain insights into the socio-demographic aspects of health, to take it back into their practice. Around the 1980s, MPHs started being offered to undergrads directly out of school to do similar things, but they haven't got the same capacity to take it into clinical care. As a result, there are a lot of MPH programs out there. It is considered a professional degree. It is cheaper for us to offer than an MSc program because you aren't working one-on-one with a professor, you aren't doing a thesis. You will do a large capstone project, which is not the same as a thesis. A thesis is genuine independent research that's gauged by a committee and you have it defended, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in my experience, my students who do MSCs in Epi, first I'll say there's no such thing as an unemployed epidemiologist. I know of one, and there's a reason she's unemployed. It has nothing to do with epidemiology. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? So there's no such thing as an unemployed epidemiologist. All of my students who with MSc Epis are snatched up pretty fast. All my students with MPHs, also 100% employed, snatched up a little bit more slowly. It just takes a bit longer. So an MPH has Epi in it. They do Epi courses, they do a biostats course, not to the same depth as an epidemiologist will, and they will not gain the same research intensity, but they can do research. I will never dissuade you for an MPH. In fact, I highly advise most health science students who don't know what they're doing, who don't want to go to medicine, to strongly consider an epidemiology program with a thesis, because it opens a lot of doors. And even if you don't want to be an epidemiologist, it makes you a better person because we're all such excellent people. It makes you a good thinker in society, a critical thinker. An MPH is a good option. Now, we have these competing new programs. There might be an MSc Epi without a thesis. I don't like that idea, but it's there. You know, the MPH is only, I think, 1 year. I can't remember. Some programs offer 1 year, 2 years, I think is typical. And U of O has starting an MPH program soon. We have an MSc Epi, which is excellent. And we have a new MSc Epi with no thesis, which I kind of look at slant-eyed, but it's there. Now, our interdisciplinary master's program, I'll be honest with you, it's got some issues. And I say that as one of the people who created it. So one of its issues is it's completely bilingual, and many of the professors teaching it are not, myself included. And as a result, often we don't do a great job. And so you're going to get a lot of diverse content for the interdisciplinary aspect, but not a lot of depth of content. So for the depth of content, you have to look to your supervisor. So if you don't know, if you're doing a thesis, you have a supervisor that oversees your project. Most of the learning you will do is via your thesis. So in our MSc Interdisciplinary Sciences program, you choose your supervisor well and choose a thesis well. Our methods are light. We introduce you to the idea of certain methods. There's a couple of exceptions. I mean, Angel Foster does a fantastic qualitative component. So you learn to do good qualitative work. But you won't get the same amount of statistics or research design as you would in Epi class. You won't get the same depth of qualitative work that you would get in a social sciences class, but you do get a good rounded understanding of all those things because it's interdisciplinary. I'm not dissuading you from the program. I'm explaining its strengths and weaknesses, okay? Because it is a good program in many ways and a bad program in some ways too, which is true for everything. I'm obviously biased towards Epi for many reasons, mostly because of the strong research bent and the fact that you can take it many places. We also have programs on this campus. The Telfer has a good health systems master's. And they, in my experience, they lean towards the qualitative side as well, which is fine. But don't forget, any program that you take, you can always take graduate courses in any other faculty. You just need permission from that faculty. It's very, very common. So let's say you do a master's in interdisciplinary health sciences and you want to do a course in advanced biostatistics. We don't offer that in health sciences. The Epi program will. You can sign up for that course. if your supervisor allows you to do so. Right. So your education is entirely in your hands. What was I going to say? Throw some questions at me if I'm blabbering, because I can talk about this forever. The thing about epidemiology, which I want you to consider, is the path before you is both governmental and private sector, and the skill sets are transferable into such areas as big data, machine learning, the corporate world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe even pandemic planning. That's obviously going to be a big thing now from now on, and your experience is going to be relevant to the rest of the world from now on. One of my former students described the MPH Epi distinction this way. He said, "You've already learned much of the social determinants of health stuff that you would get in an MPH program from your health sciences undergrad. That's what we're good at, right? Determinants of health. A lot of people aren't good at that. A lot of clinicians, that blows their mind that, hey, what's the cause of malaria? Is it mosquitoes? Is it the Plasmodium parasite? Or is it poverty?" That blows their mind, right? That's obvious to you. So that's built into the MPH program. If you can add to what you know already about that softer sociodemographic stuff with really good, hard statistical and research design skills or qualitative methodologies as well, then you have a really powerful skill set. So maybe you don't want to do more of the same of what you're doing. You want to augment the skills you already have with different skills, more harder and difficult to access skills, because the world values things that are hard to get. Right? So if everybody else is doing it, it may be easier to get. It's getting harder to get into epi programs. My biggest advice to get into any grad program, especially epi programs, is try to get research experience that you can put in that letter and in your resume. It's hard as an undergrad, but everyone's got high marks now. And by the way, if you don't have high marks, it doesn't mean your path is done. There are other, the doors are still opening. Don't worry about that. It's just a little easier if you got all A's. But if everyone's got all A's, you got to stand out a bit, and that research experience really matters. So when we're sitting around that table, gauging applicants, we do look at, oh, this person wrote a paper. This person worked with a professor for a summer. Or this person didn't do any of those things, but got together with some friends and wrote a commentary for the school paper or for some other journal. Peer-reviewed publication is best if you can get one. So if you're not doing a 4900 independent research project, consider doing one if you got time. If not, volunteer with the professor and get some research under your belt. If you can't do that, consider some paper that you've written already that you're really proud of. You can rewrite that and submit to a journal. That matters. If you haven't done those things, then do a lot of reading. So when you apply to a grad school, it's important to know about that grad school. Cite the work of the professors in that school in your letter. Mention you've read that groundbreaking new study by Dr. Robitaille on syndemics and the other fascinating things that she's doing, because her ego will be out to here. She'll remember you. She's around that table. It's going to count. But beyond that, it's also, if you use the language of the field, then we know that you're serious. The one thing we do not want is someone wasting our time. Oh, someone wrote to a question here. Your thoughts on MPH program with the concentration in epi. Okay, that's a marketing gimmick. All MPH programs have a concentration in epi. So I'm going to sound really cynical here, but I think you need to know the truth. And this is my version of the truth. Your market is employers. The university's market is you. The two are not aligned necessarily. So beware of fancy sounding programs that sound really cool to get your attention and your money, but they don't give you any advantage in life. Okay, so as an example, I'm going to point to a particular university has a master's in global health. Sounds great. Students love it, have a great time, learn nothing. Right, and so then they graduate and they can't get maybe they don't want, maybe the job is not on their radar. Maybe they just want to go straight to medical school. That's fine. But if you're looking for a competitive advantage in the work world, look for a competitive advantage in the work world. Now, an MPH program should have a focus on epi. If it doesn't, there's something wrong with it. So if you do an MPH program, and I hope you do because they're excellent programs. And again, I have former students who offer me jobs now because they have done so well in their lives with MPHs that they're in powerful management positions already. And but they do focus on certain skill sets. So let me go off on a tangent for a second here. In my opinion, there's a couple of things you should really be investing in terms of skills for your long-term career and for success in grad school, regardless what program you get into. Number one is learn a deep analysis. And that analysis could be biostatistics, could be epidemiological in terms of research design, could be some qualitative stuff, it could be econometrics, it could be interviewing skills, but some ability to analyze data, to take data and create information, and from that information, wisdom. The world wants that. That's number one. Number two is learn to communicate. That's not just giving Zoom talks like this, but also writing. It's never too late to be a good writer. And if you can do both, then you are a lower pantheon god in the realms of job seekage. So the more of these types of skills you can acquire in short order, the more powerful you will be, because it is a competitive world out there. That's what we're looking for. So these former students of mine who've done well have really coalesced around one or both of those two skill sets. Right? And the communications one is a fast track towards management. The analytical one is a fast track towards other kinds of opportunities. Maybe you don't like statistics. Who does? Who likes statistics? I hate it and I teach it. Oh, Annie likes it. There's always one. There's always one. But you don't have to love it to just be good enough to be able to understand it when someone else talks about it. So I don't do any stats. I hire statisticians because I hate it, but they have to be able to explain to me what's going on, right? But maybe the epi aspects that you like are the communications aspects. Maybe it's the equity aspects. Maybe because epidemiology now is segueing into political science, to big data, to economics. Health economics is a huge growth area, by the way. And there are two ways in. One is through economics, and the other is through epidemiology. And in Canada, there may be 15 PhD level health economists that are in great demand at all times. You have a shortage. Yeah, we're doing time-wise, 2:15. I think time's almost up. So hopefully I've covered all the stuff. If I had to rank what I think a student should be applying for, if their goal is a competitive career in the overall health aspect sector, and they're really concerned about getting a job, I would put an MSc with epidemiology and a thesis at number one. And by the way, all the schools in Canada are great, every single one. And if you want me to rank which ones are best, I can do that too, but they're all fine. Number two, I would say an MSc Epi without a thesis, maybe. But I would really look askance at that. But number two, I think it's an MPH. MPH with a capstone project, as they all do, because they're really quite good. And number four would be any other science masters with a thesis. And after that would be any other science masters with no thesis. The thesis is kind of important because it shows that you can work independently, and everything you learn will be in the thesis. Really, honestly, you won't pay attention in class because who does? Right now you're not. but you'll learn from doing, right? So it's critical. Do a thesis and start looking now. It's never wrong to talk to professors. So let's say EPI programs don't require you to get a supervisor first. They don't. You can just apply now and they'll find you a supervisor for the first year, and then you negotiate after that to get your permanent one. The Masters of Interdisciplinary Health Sciences does require you to have a supervisor. So if you're going to apply to that one, start talking to professors now, and they need to write a letter saying, I accept this person. The Masters of Health Systems also requires a supervisor. And it can be anyone on campus, by the way. It doesn't have to be someone from that department. You just got to negotiate a project. And the project is between you and the supervisor to decide. Now, if you're looking to get a supervisor now, I know it's terrifying. I get that. Start sending emails to professors saying, I've read this paper of yours, and read the paper. Don't just skim the abstract. Says, I wonder if I can talk to you about it. I'm looking at grad programs. They know what you're asking. And they'll either say, yeah, I'm happy to talk to you about it, but I haven't got space in my lab right now, or go away, or sure, let's talk about it. Then here's your chance to impress them. If they say no, That's okay. You still learn something, and that person will remember you. Interpersonal contact's important because that person might end up being on the admissions committee anyway and say, hey, I remember that person that they came to talk to me, and maybe their marks aren't great, but they seem pretty eager. We should give them a chance. Right? So unlike medical school, with grad programs, your marks aren't as important. They're still important though, but not as important. Epi is getting so competitive that the marks threshold is getting pretty important. Our program in health sciences, the marks threshold is pretty low. So if a supervisor wants you, you're probably in. They just have to say they want you. And that's true for a lot of programs. MPH, I don't know what the criteria are. It is technically a professional degree. Some programs may require a GRE or GMAT. For the health systems degree, they definitely do require a standardized test. They will say GRE, but they will accept the GMAT. They will accept the MCAT. They won't tell you that, but they will. And they're just looking for a pass. You don't have to have a really high score. They're looking to make sure you're not intellectually challenged. But, that you actually can string words together and things like that. So it's a very, very low threshold for passing that standardized test for the Telfer system and for some of the other MPH programs. And also consider online programs. There's some excellent online MPHs, even a couple of online MSCs. I would say the very best one is Johns Hopkins, London School of Tropical Health and Hygiene, Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, LSHTM, whatever that stands for. They have a great fantastic online program. Expensive though. European schools you will get into. Might be expensive to get there, but they're cheap to attend. Sorbonne, Karolinska, excellent epi and master's programs. Probably, in my opinion, the single very best epi and public health school is Johns Hopkins. Up there too would be USC and Columbia, Harvard top 10. Harvard. But the Canadian schools are really quite good. I would say the very best Canadian school is probably McGill, and they know it. It hurts me to say that. but Ottawa, and each school focuses on different things, but you will get strong basics in all of them. For example, in my opinion, Ottawa U is pretty good at health economics and pretty good at clinical trial stuff. Western is good at cancer, as is Kingston. U of T thinks they're good at global health. McMaster is good at evidence. UB, some schools people never think about. Saskatchewan, fantastic school. And by the way, I didn't mention yet veterinary epidemiology. Nobody ever gives this any thought. But that's a powerful, powerful career trajectory. And of course, the universities with vet schools have good programs like Saskatchewan and Guelph. Unfortunately, the veterinary epi world doesn't interact a whole lot with the human epi world. They don't come to our conferences a lot. We don't go to their conferences, which is a shame. But agricultural health is a huge thing, and there's always opportunity there. So if that piques your interest, explore it. So I've rambled on for a good hour and a half there. I will stop it there unless there are some questions. I don't see any questions in the chat screen, or somebody want to pipe up? Anybody? Anybody? Nobody? Tell me a joke. Nobody? Silence from the peanut gallery. I miss teaching. Not really.
I was hoping we were going to see the baby.
Oh, he just left. So I'm visiting my parents right now, and my girlfriend / wife, whatever you want to call her, I don't know. I got a silicone ring. Took him to her place. My dog's here. The baby puked on me. So I was on the National this morning. You'll see it tonight on tonight's broadcast. And I combed my hair, I shaved, and I took the camera up, and the baby puked on me seconds before going on air. So tonight you'll see me on TV, and I'll be covered in prunes.
It makes it for a better interview.
Yeah. So I'll brace for the hate mail. By the way, I do get hate mail every day, and the hate mail this is the thing with epidemiology you have to understand. We are having our moment right now, no question, but we are being unfairly blamed for the economic restrictions. So, that's the flip side of a little bit of fame at the moment for our profession. And I do worry that at the end of all this, people will think either we overreacted or we didn't, or we underreacted, and no one will thank us for having any sort of insights. But there it is. All right. I'm getting all these wonderful thank you messages on the chat screen. Thank you so much. I love it. So hopefully we'll put
I
this on
knew they'd
YouTube.
love you.
Ah. And oh,
I absolutely loved it.
here's my I buy these Captain America t-shirts in bulk from China. They're $1.99 each. And so the baby pukes on them.
Nice. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Logging off. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.